Welcome to RSG Insider, where we discuss issues facing local jurisdictions. My name is Tara Matthews, and I'm a principal at RSG, and today I'm joined by Dominique Clark, and we'll be discussing all things rent stabilization petitions. Before we begin, Dominique, maybe you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I am a director with RSG, and I've been with the firm for 10 years. I've been processing rent increase petitions for the last 7 of those years in various communities throughout California. I'm excited to talk about this.
Let's get started. Let's now just start with what is rent stabilization?
Yeah, so rent stabilization is commonly referred to as rent control, and there are slight nuances between the two terms, but in a nutshell, rent stabilization is when a city or a county or even a state puts limits on how much a property owner can increase rents for residential tenants. So rent stabilization isn't new and it's not unique to California. For the last several decades, cities and counties throughout the country have been implementing various forms of rent stabilization. But there's been a lot of discussion about it lately in California because in 2019, the state implemented annual rent increase limits for various types of rentals throughout the state. So then that was 2019. And then in 2020, the pandemic happened, of course. So a lot of renters were struggling with paying rents. So I think a lot of cities, for the first time, started thinking about implementing rent stabilization programs. And then even jurisdictions that already had a program decided to refresh their program. So there's been a lot of discussion about it lately.
Thank you for the context on what rent stabilization is. Can you maybe talk a little bit about rent stabilization and petitions? How do those two things interact together, and why is the topic of petitions important when discussing rent stabilization?
So processing petitions is a key component of rent stabilization because in some communities with rent increase limits, in order for a property owner to increase rents, they have to get approval from the local jurisdiction first. And the rent petition is the formal request for that approval. And I should note that even after the 2019 statewide rent increase limits were put in place, cities and counties still have the option of implementing lower limits than the state limits in their local jurisdiction.
Is there only one type of petition, or are there multiple types of petitions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's actually 3 types of rent increase petitions. I can walk us through each one. So the first one is the fair return petition. So in the United States, property owners always have a right to receive a fair return on their investment. So that means even in communities with the rent increase limits, those communities have to provide another process for those owners to request a rent increase higher than the established rent increase limits. So different communities do different things. They call it by different names, but the most common term is a fair return petition. And so when this petition is filed, the property owner is claiming that the established rent limits are preventing them from achieving a fair return on their investment. And so if they can prove that that's the case, then the jurisdiction may award them a higher rent increase than the limits allow.
Oh, interesting. So even though there's a limit in place, a property owner may still be able to receive something higher.
Exactly. So that's the first type. And then the second type is what we call CPI petitions. So in most communities with rent increase limits, they don't require property owners to submit a petition if they're looking to increase rents within the limits. So it's kind of like an honor system where the city sets the limits and then they expect all the owners to abide by them with the check and balance that residents, if they're made aware that they're being charged excessive rent, they always have that option to go to the city and ask the city to get involved. But some communities choose not to do the honor system, and instead they say that even if a property owner wants to increase rents within limits, they have to submit a petition and get formal approval. And so because most rent increase limits are tied to inflation, which is measured by the Consumer Price Index or CPI, we typically call those CPI petitions.
So those are two ways an owner can potentially get a rent increase.
Exactly. And then the third way is what's called a capital improvement rent increase petition. So this is a property owner's request to increase rents to reimburse themselves for either adding a new amenity to the property, like a pool or a playground, or doing major rehabilitation. So, examples of that are upgrading utility systems or replacing a common area roof. So the unique thing about a capital improvement petition is that it is temporary. So it's approved for a certain amount of time, however much time is needed for the property owner to be reimbursed for their investment, maybe with interest. That varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But then once they're reimbursed, the rent increase goes away.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that the first two that you mentioned are rent increases that kind of last forever, but a capital is just temporary amount of time that someone would have to pay that amount.
Yeah, exactly. And then I should mention that some communities have a fourth type of petition that's actually for a rent decrease instead of a rent increase. And as you can imagine, this is submitted by tenants and not landlords. But in the communities that allow this, the tenant petition is submitted when the tenant feels that either a rent freeze or a rent decrease is warranted because they're receiving less services from the property owner. So an example that we've been seeing a lot of lately is where a resident might initially be given a garage with their unit. The property owner later decides to convert the garage to another use, maybe to an ADU, so they can get more rental income. And so if that community has a tenant petition process, the tenant can submit a petition and ask for a reduction in rent since they're no longer being provided a garage. And then some communities also allow for tenant petitions when the property owner isn't complying with rent increase limits, or they're not complying with health and safety standards, or there's a lot of construction activity going on the property and it's disrupting the lives of tenants over a long period of time.
So it sounds like there's a lot of kind of variation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and kind of a lot of different nuances between the different types of petitions.
Absolutely.
So, kind of following up on that, what types of petitions does RSG have experience working on? And why would cities or communities hire RSG or another consultant to help process petitions? Rather than potentially maybe those being done in-house?
Yeah, those are great questions. So RSG has extensive experience processing all four types of petitions, both for rental units and for mobile home spaces. And when a city or county receives a petition, it's critical that they have access to both legal counsel and consultants that have a depth of experience processing petitions. And the reason I say that is because if there are any missteps in the petition process, that could make the entire rent stabilization program vulnerable to serious legal challenges. So RSG is one of those consultants that is well versed in rent stabilization programs, and we can be a neutral third party to assist with that process. And then in addition to helping communities process petitions, we also help communities establish a petition process for the first time or strengthen their petition process based on the best practices that we've learned as we process petitions throughout the state.
Sounds very helpful, and there's a lot of legal compliance, and it sounds like complexities of managing again the interests of the tenants versus the property
Absolutely.
owners, depending on who's submitting those various petitions. So what is RSG's role in processing the petitions? Can you kind of walk us through the steps that are undertaken when a petition is received?
Sure. So RSG's role when we're helping a community process a petition is we make sure that the decision makers have all the information they need to make their determination. So we're not decision makers ourselves, but we're helping whoever the decision maker is, which might be a city manager or a rent review board or a hearing officer. We're making sure they have the most accurate and complete data available so that they can make their decision. And then as far as what we do tactically, it varies widely from community to community. So there's some communities where we're essentially an extension of staff. And so we pretty much handle the entire process from reviewing the petition to drafting the report for the approving body to coordinating with the property owner and all the residents. And then in other communities, they have staff that's willing and able to take on some of that. So we just divide roles between the both of us. So it really depends on what the community needs, and we're happy to do as little or as much as is needed.
You had mentioned this in-depth petition process that has to be put in place. Do you have any advice for a jurisdiction that is looking to implement a rent stabilization program with the required petition process to ensure that that process goes smoothly?
Yes, definitely. So my biggest advice is to balance the needs of the tenants and the property owners. And of course, the $1 million question is how? How do you balance the needs of two groups that have completely different interests, right? So a property owner typically wants as much income as they can get, and then renters typically want their rent as low as possible. So how do you find a way to balance both of those needs, right? So in our experience processing petitions throughout the state, we've seen that the strongest petition processes check 3 boxes. So one box is that the process is thoughtfully designed. The second is that it's transparent. And the third is that it's data driven. So I can talk a little bit about each one. So as far as thoughtfully designed, it takes a lot of time and care to think about how to address the needs of both owners and renters. So I can give you an example in the case of a fair return petition. So in a fair return petition, typically renters are concerned that the owner is overstating how much it costs to manage the property. So a thoughtful way to address that issue from the get-go is to require the owners to provide backup for their reported expenses. So we're talking report or receipts and as well as proof of payment, which is a lot to ask for them of them, but it's really important in order to address that valid concern of residents. On the flip side, a common concern of owners is that they're going into this process, they're providing all of this data, opening up their books to the public, and they're not even guaranteed a specific rent increase amount. It's possible that they might be denied a rent increase altogether, or they're going to get a rent increase that's much lower than what they are anticipating. So a thoughtful way to address that up front is to include in the ordinance or in a separate set of guidelines how a fair return rent increase is calculated. So that way they can at least kind of guesstimate what's going to be approved before they decide whether to embark down this process. So that's thoughtfully designed. Secondly, I think a strong petition process is transparent, meaning that the steps of the process are laid out in the ordinance or the guidelines so that both parties, the renters and the property owners, know what to expect and also know how and when they can engage in the process. I think that's really important. I think another part of transparency is maintaining a strong line of communication with both parties to keep both parties aware of where the petition is, any important deadlines that are coming up. So that's transparency. And then lastly, I think a strong petition process is data-driven. So as you can imagine, any conversations about rent increases are very contentious, potentially. So I think data has a really good way of providing clarity so we can more objectively balance what the residents are claiming and what the owner is claiming. So I can give you an example of that. In the case of a capital improvement petition, there's a lot of quantifiable factors that we can look at to help us determine what a fair rent increase would be. So we ask questions like, how much are the capital improvements, again, substantiated by receipts and proof of payment? We can also ask how many households are benefiting from the capital improvements. And then we also want to know about how long do we anticipate the capital improvements lasting. So these are all things that if we take the time, we can find that data, and that kind of helps provide clarity. So we love helping communities figure out how to either create a strong petition process or improve their petition process to make sure that it checks all 3 boxes, thoughtfully designed, transparent, and data-driven.
Yeah, it sounds like a really detailed process. And so thank you for kind of going through that with so much clarity.
Sure.
What is the outcome of all of this? What is a typical outcome after you go through? It sounds like looking at expenses and asking all of those really important questions. Then what happens?
Yeah, so I would say that petitions typically are a long and complex process, but I'm really proud of the fact that it's not uncommon for after a rent increase hearing in which the rent increase amount is finally determined for both representatives of the owner and tenants to come up to RSG to thank us. And I think that they really appreciate that we help all the parties navigate the process. And I think they can tell that we deeply care about presenting accurate information in a thoughtful, thorough, unbiased, and clear way. And they appreciate that. And I would just say that this work is contentious and challenging for sure, but it is incredibly important work. We're talking about people's housing, which is inherently personal. And then we're also talking about people's finances, both the personal finances of the tenants and the bottom line of the property owner. So these are all very touchy subjects that affect people's day-to-day lives. But I think at the end of the day, RSG's job is to be an unbiased voice in the discussion to help navigate the process. And I think we do that really well.
Well, thank you so much, Dominique, for all of your insight. You're very knowledgeable on the topic. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today to learn about rent stabilization petitions.